This podcast is brought to you by Big Motoring World, one of the UK's largest used car supermarkets. To verify and find out more, go to bigmotoringworld.co.uk. Welcome to Legends of News, the podcast that taps into the experience and insight of those who spent many decades in front row seats, as the saying goes, at the making of history. You'll be getting a unique perspective from people who've personally witnessed and sometimes created some of the most extraordinary moments of the last half a century and more. My guest today is a journalist, author and occasional politician who spent more than 40 years at the BBC. He's written several fiction and non-fiction books and now insists I call him Chancellor for some reason. He is Gavin Esler. Very good to see you, Gavin. How are you?
I'm very well, Dermot. A recovering journalist and hardly a politician, I would say, for 5 minutes. That was about it.
Exactly. We'll talk about that in a bit. But I want to do the Chancellor bit. You're a recovering Chancellor. You've spent 10 years out of the BBC, haven't you, as Chancellor of the University of Kent?
Yeah, that was a great honour, actually. You get to dress up in robes that were made for Princess Marina in the 1960s. And I have to say, I've never met her, but she must have been a big lass. That's all I'd say, because they were silk with gold braiding, and my goodness, were they heavy and hot. And even in Canterbury Cathedral, it was a bit of a struggle to walk up the aisle wearing Princess Marina's garb. I think it was slightly recostumed for me, but very nice it was too.
I just don't think we've ever started one of these podcasts with a discussion about cross-dressing, but there's always a first. Thank you very much indeed for that, Gavin. But let's look at the journalistic career. As I say, more than 4 decades with the BBC. I mean, was it always, just the motivation? Was it a passion of yours? Was it always an ambition from, small child? Because we talked to lots of people who've had that to be a journalist.
Absolutely not. No, I wanted to be. I was very ill when I was a few weeks old, 3 weeks old, and taken to. I was born in Clydebank, born in Glasgow. And I was taken to hospital, was operated on and survived. And so I spent, my family moved to Edinburgh, and I spent most of my life until I was about 16 or 17 thinking I was going to be a doctor. I was very keen on it. I was very keen to be a surgeon. I knew surgeons saved lives. They saved my life. And that's what I wanted to do. And then my father, during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, got a better job in Northern Ireland. And I started to go there I stayed in the last year because the Scottish system is very different from the English system of education when you're, and it's much better in my view, frankly, because you don't have to choose 3 A-levels and then, get your career going then. I was able to do sciences and arts. And when I went over to Northern Ireland quite a lot for my holidays, I realised that actually the stuff I was reading, the fiction I was reading, I wanted to be a writer and a journalist. And so I changed horses fairly quickly.
Was that also because of what you were seeing? I mean, this was the height of the Troubles, wasn't it? I was there. I was at school, and that was part of my motivation to become a journalist. You kind of become politicised in spite of yourself. You've got to be aware of what's going on around you.
Yeah, I mean, my parents lived in a town which was probably about 75% Protestant, 25 to 30% Catholic. My friends were Catholic and Protestants. And during the marching season, during the summer, July in particular, a bit of August, my Catholic friends didn't go to the discos, didn't go to the dances. They just literally did not. And it was not a violent town. There was very little trouble, but they didn't feel comfortable. And I thought, my goodness, this is part of the United Kingdom. And also Ireland, the Irish Republic, is a place I love. I travel a lot there. I just thought, this is so strange. Why is it? And that was what really set off the journalistic instinct. And in fact, I ended up beginning my career as a journalist in Northern Ireland with the Belfast Telegraph.
Oh, great stuff. And then, but you moved pretty rapidly then, didn't you, into the BBC?
I did. I moved to the BBC in Northern Ireland. I'm not sure many British, as in not Northern Ireland journalists, wanted to work in Northern Ireland. I think that's why I got the job. I worked for Spotlight. I replaced some guy called Jeremy Paxman. I never figured out what happened to him. Anyway, he moved on somewhere or other, and Spotlight was amazing. I mean, it was a 30-minute program once a week. Sometimes it'd just be an interview, and sometimes it would be an investigation. And I did a number. One of the ones that I'm most proud of is I did an investigation into some bombings that had happened in England, and a man called Giuseppe Conlon and his family were essentially a massive miscarriage of justice. They were all Catholics from Northern Ireland, and they were in Annie's bomb factory, except there were no bombs. And Giuseppe Conlon was a very sick, older guy, and he died in prison. But I'm fortunate enough to say that a Conservative MP, John Biggs Davison, and a Social Democratic and Labour MP, Jerry Fitt, took up the case after the Spotlight broadcast, and they were all finally, those in prison were finally released. So I'm very, very proud of that, because I thought, whatever you think, I mean, of course we all hated the terrorism. It was absolutely awful. But you don't cure terrorism by putting people in jail who are innocent.
I mean, really important bit of journalism there, Gavin. And I mean, just thinking on the broad point, there are a lot of parallels, aren't there, between Scotland, particularly Glasgow, and Belfast in terms of that sectarian divide, the sectarian mix. I mean, you know, did that give you a bit of a deeper understanding of what was going on?
Yeah, totally. I mean, my family are Protestants, Presbyterians. A few members of my family supported Rangers. Most members of my family just refused to get involved in the Rangers Celtic stuff. And sadly, it put me off football for years. It really did. I just thought, wait a minute. I went to a few Rangers matches, and one, this was a friendly with an English club. I won't say which club. The Rangers supporters were chanting, "You must be Celtic in disguise," and some other things which I won't say, but refer to, shall we say, the Battle of Boyne in 1690 and who won. And I thought, wait a minute. You're playing Fulham. What is this about? So I'm very proud of my Glasgow heritage, but I'm not very proud of the sectarianism that sometimes...
Indeed. And were you proud about getting into the BBC? Because didn't you get rejected several times when you applied to their trainee scheme when you were at university?
I was worse than rejected. I got one rejection letter, and then the second time I didn't even get a reply. Which so I've been getting my revenge on them ever since. I don't think it was them being mean. I think it was just a bureaucratic cock-up, which of course is unusual in the BBC.
Imagine those. Yes, we might discuss those a little bit later on. So when did you get to the so-called Big B? When did you get to that London and start on the big channels?
Well, for me, the breakthrough was Newsnight. Newsnight was fairly new, and they didn't have anybody in Northern Ireland. And I did a couple of reports for Northern Ireland, and I think they took them and cut them down a bit. I was doing 25 to 30-minute sort of documentaries. And they asked me if I would come over for an attachment, which was, I think it was 6 weeks. And it was kind of sink or swim. I was told by the boss, you know, most people at the end of 6 weeks, we send them home and then we never see them again. So they saw me again, and I did quite a lot of stuff from Northern Ireland, and then I moved to England, and I went backwards and forwards to Northern Ireland, and then travelled the world with Newsnight. So I was so grateful. It was a great programme to work on, extraordinary programme to work on.
Do you think, well, let's jump forward. Do you think it's still extraordinary now?
Well, I think TV has changed completely. I mean, obviously, Newsnight is not a program where they send, as they did with me, they sent me off, I'm not kidding you, to Hawaii to investigate a CIA scandal. Now, I'd be very happy to go off to Hawaii right now and investigate a CIA scandal. Things have changed. And also, to be frank, most people now don't necessarily want to sit down and watch television or the news or even listen to radio when we as broadcasters want to give it to them. We want to see things when we want to see things. So if you want the news now, at the time we're doing our discussion, you could find the news that's adequate to you. So the built programs, the idea that we'd all sit around the TV at 10 o'clock at night or 10:30 at night for Newsnight or whatever it was, it's not gone completely, but it is difficult to sustain in this new atmosphere. And that's not the BBC's fault. It's not anybody's fault, actually. It's just the way life is.
So let's continue with that career trajectory. You get your big start at Newsnight, but then you left them, did you? I mean, Newsnight. And then how quickly did you end up in the United States as US correspondent?
Well, for Newsnight, I spent a lot of time working in the United States, going across sometimes for 3 or 4 weeks at a time, doing quite a bit of coverage there with that great reporter Martin Bell was the bureau chief, and there were changes in the bureau, and I applied for the job and eventually got Martin's job as the chief correspondent over there. And I have to say, I loved it. It was, well, just to give you an example, before Bill Clinton had announced he was running for the presidency of the United States, I was doing a couple of films up in New Hampshire, which is where the first primaries are, and the selecting who will finally be their candidate or their nominee. And I literally bumped into Bill Clinton at about 7 o'clock in the morning. I was wearing a suit and tie because I was going off to do something. I can't remember what, but I do remember what happened. Clinton, who was wearing a very tight Lycra jogging suit, and he's a big lad, he bumped into me and we started talking for about half an hour. And what emerged from that, apart from the fact he's sort of ruthlessly charming, and very, very interesting, was that I was looking for a way of telling the story of how the Democrats probably were going to lose the 1992 presidential election. That was the general view. And Clinton, he confessed to me afterwards, was kind of desperate to have a TV crew following him around because nobody knew who the heck he was in New Hampshire. So there's a kind of synergy of journalism, if you like, which is that I wanted a story. He liked the idea of a TV crew. He'd say in these small meetings in New Hampshire with 40 or 50 people, and look, I'm important. Look, there's the BBC. They've come all the way from England or Washington, in fact. So, it was an amazing time. And actually, I know Mr. Clinton has gone through various kind of difficulties, but I have to say he has got the most amazing memory. He was one of those who had a Rolodex mind. We talked about our fathers who both fought in the army. His father, he was born William Jefferson Blythe. And his father, they changed the name to Clinton when his mother remarried after his father died. And he was a veteran of the North Africa campaign in World War II. My father was a veteran of the North Africa campaign in World War II. And Clinton never forgot things like that. So that was my fascination and my entry to United States politics.
Bill Clinton, my part in his ascent. That's amazing. And what were the other big interviews, the main events of that time in the United States? Did you come across the previous president, George Bush 1, so to speak?
Very, 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 in a very minor way. Somebody much more important than me was getting to interview him for the BBC, and I turned up to help with the cameras and all that sort of thing. And what I remember most was that when they put tone down the line, which listeners may not know, but it's something to make, I don't know what it does actually, but they put it right into George H.W. Bush's ear. And he was not a happy president, let's put it that way. So, but I loved it. I loved the access to the White House. I loved the discussions. And also, here's another example. Bob Dole, who was the Republican leader at the time, another World War II veteran. And we talked a bit about that because he was physically quite damaged by World War II. He could shake hands with his left hand, but his right arm had some difficulties. And I remember saying to him, Hillary Clinton produced this massive bill on healthcare. I think it was 3,000 pages long. And it was rejected by the Congress. And Senator Dole was the Republican leader, and I was lucky enough to interview him about something and talking to him about stuff. And I said to him in the interview, Senator, you voted against this bill. It's 3,000 pages long. I bet you haven't even read it. And he looked at me for a moment and said, son, I couldn't even lift it. Now, so as you can tell, I'm a big fan of the United States.
So when did you leave? When did you came back to Newsnight? What, in the 2000s, was it? And
I came back, but then I went back again to do some, but not as a sort of resident journalist. I did stuff with Obama and others. The Obama running for the presidency was also amazing. I mean, here's the first African American president of the United States. He was really cool. I spent quite a lot of time in Chicago, including in the famous blues and jazz clubs of Chicago.
God, it was a tough assignment, wasn't it?
It was a terrible assignment, having to talk to people in blues clubs about why he'd make a great president. They thought he would.
And so when you did, when you were installed permanently at Newsnight, you replaced, didn't you? Somebody else, that name escapes me. Jeremy Vine. Whatever happened to him?
I don't know. I have no idea. It's funny how these people disappear, isn't it?
No, Jeremy moved on, didn't he, to replace Jimmy Young, I remember, at Radio 2, and the career's obviously gone through the roof. But were those the happiest times then? You were in charge of the big desk, this muscular programme, interviewing, the hugest personalities, not just politics.
Yeah, it was great fun. It was politics and culture. I used to do quite a lot on Fridays, as Kirsty Wark, and would do the cultural things on Friday, because there was a slightly different atmosphere on the Friday program, which I think was just right for the times. And also Newsnight was, in the BBC jargon, appointment to view. Not everybody liked it, not everybody watched it, but lots of people did, and all the politicians did, and they were all pleased to come on it. And they were also, many of them were very pleased to sit around afterwards and talk. And you got a real sense of the human beings behind not just the talk, but the kind of, how do you appear on television kind of stuff that unfortunately politicians go through, which turns them into a bit like robots, Just for example, how many times have you heard somebody be asked a difficult question and the response begins, well, what I can say is, and they talk about, flying around the moon or something completely different. So we're in, things have changed. And the other thing that's changed, and I write a lot about this in my most recent books, is lying. Most politicians, most of the time, are really decent people, but we have normalized lying in public life, particularly in the United States, but it's come in here too. And it's quite difficult. It's very un-British to say somebody's a liar, I think. It's not just in Parliament.
You get thrown out of Parliament. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, you get thrown out of Parliament. And we had the ridiculous case of a Labour MP who called Boris Johnson a liar for lying about various things. And she was thrown out of Parliament. And Boris Johnson, who, let's put it this way, had been seriously economical with the truth, remained. So, I get it. I get that we can't have Parliament where everybody goes, you're lying, you're lying, you're lying. On the other hand, there comes a point where we've got to hold people to account for saying things which are just factually not true.
Well, Gavin, then what's your technique for dealing with that? The robots, as you described them, because I was there, I was at the BBC. I remember you getting into, was it trouble? But anyway, it was controversy about an interview with George Galloway. You had a big Barney with him. Who doesn't have a Barney with George Galloway? But there was some discussion. And you were there at the same time, weren't you? Of course, as Jeremy Paxman, and the danger always is to be compared to Jeremy Paxman, only being a lesser version of. What was your technique to be different, to try to uncover the bee shitting?
Well, I never tried to be different from Jeremy or anything other than whatever I am myself. And the George Galloway interview was very simple, actually. It was the 7/7 bomb, day of 7/7. It was it was the same day, and I'd been down at the site. I'd gone down to King's Cross, and George Galloway blamed Tony Blair for the bombings, when the bodies of those murdered in this atrocity had not yet been recovered, and indeed were still warm because of the heat down underneath the tube lines. And I thought that was incredibly insensitive and inappropriate for the families of those who had lost their loved ones in a terrorist attack, suddenly to point the finger at someone because you're a politician and he's a politician and you don't like him. I thought that was appalling. Now, people can judge me for pointing that out, and that's absolutely fine.
We'll take a short break there. This podcast is brought to you by Big Motoring World, one of the UK's largest used car supermarkets. Big Motoring World checks vehicle pricing regularly to give you their best price guaranteed. And with their new finance package, you can get a rate as low as 9.9% APR. That's 11.9% APR representative. With a wide choice of vehicles and a focus on customer service, Big Motoring World supports drivers through each step of the process. Their stated aim is to be, in their words, big on what matters to you. Search bigmotoringworld.co.uk to verify and to find your nearest store. That's bigmotoringworld.co.uk. Tell me about some of the cultural side, because it wasn't just the hard politicians you were dealing with on Newsnight. I mean, because you presented film review programmes as well, didn't you? And on Newsnight itself, of course, it was a very broad church. I remember watching, one of my personal heroes, you and Dolly Parton, not Dolly standing Parton for election. She should.
I'm glad we've gone on to Dolly Parton from... I went to Dollywood. I went to her. No, I didn't actually. I went to her house in
I'm
Nashville.
So jealous.
Yeah, and I spent the day with Dolly Parton. And oh gosh, I told my wife this. I'm slightly in love with Dolly Parton, but that's it's okay. It's okay. What happened was we had an interview arranged, and I got to put some viewers' questions to her, among other things. It was for BBC World and for BBC domestically in Britain, and the questions were a few of the questions were slightly rude. For instance, how long does it take to do your hair? And she said, I don't know, I'm never there.
Perfect, isn't it? Yeah.
She's absolutely delightful. And do the dumb blonde jokes get in your nerves was another one. And she said, I don't know, honey, I'm not dumb and I'm not blonde. So, we had such a hoot. And also, she is someone with a great hinterland. It's not just her personal story of growing up fairly poor in the Appalachian Mountains and so on, but she puts back so much. She runs a book club, which means that kids who may be in homes who wouldn't otherwise get books, get them. She's a great woman, a great singer, and yeah.
And smart as a whip, great one-liners. Why did you leave the Beeb then? I mean, you had your run-ins, didn't you, with management, talking about Clinton's, of course, when Hillary Clinton first tried to run 2008 against Obama. Didn't you write an article that you got a rap over the knuckles for, saying, why we need Hillary Clinton? Yeah,
well, that was the headline. It was for the Mirror. And I didn't say why we need Hillary Clinton. And I didn't believe that America needed Hillary Clinton. I think she's a fascinating character, but they put a headline on it that said why we need Hillary Clinton. Wasn't me, Gov, but I was blamed for it. So it was a minor problem, it seemed to me.
Well, talk to me about, though, BBC management. They talk about themselves, of course. As we speak now in 2025, as ex-BBC, as you a lot longer than me, we recognise, don't we, the current travails of the BBC. We recognise what happened before. It just seems to repeat itself. How and why does the BBC get into these messes continuously? And how does it prevent it, in your view?
Well, I think part of it is to understand that one of the reasons the BBC gets into these problems is the BBC remains very important and still remains the most trusted news source in Britain, I think, or major news source. But trust in all media has gone down over the years. Trust in everything has gone down, actually. One of the peculiarities of Britain is that we trust each other much more than we trust, for example, the government. And that's just any government. British people kind of trust each other, which is interesting, more than other OECD countries. And the BBC as a major institution inevitably is going to attract a great deal of scrutiny. We all pay for it. We all feel part of it. And I think that's all good. I think I look at it slightly optimistically. The pessimistic view is that, part of that means there will always be mistakes. There will always be, in the case of various documentaries and so on, you'll get other people to do it, and it has to be based on trust. And things like Glastonbury, which is a great societal and social and musical and cultural event, it would obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, have been a good idea to have someone with news judgment, with strong news judgment and news backing, sitting in the gallery just in case somebody said something that was deeply offensive. Now, that's with hindsight. I don't know if I would have thought of that beforehand. I mean, I don't think Rod Stewart was going to say anything particularly offensive, so that may be a waste of time. So I actually personally cut the BBC a great deal of slack for much of this stuff. It's not because the people at the top are incompetent. It's not because they don't care. It's because actually events change things, and our culture has changed very, very rapidly. And they have to be aware that there will always be people who will find things, because there are things to find, that the BBC does wrong.
Indeed. Talk to me about, I mentioned in your short introduction, the politics. There you are talking to me. We've talked extensively about, cutting through the obfuscating of politicians. There's a slight lack of respect, isn't there? Particularly, as they get more and more media trained. And then you go and stand for the European Parliament, as then was the last elections for them in the United Kingdom, in your hope, perhaps not the last ones. You became very volubly anti-Brexit and pro-rejoin after the referendum, and stood for, long forgotten now, Change UK in 2019, didn't you?
Yeah, well, I think Change UK lasted about 6 weeks.
Yeah.
But the reason I did it was absolutely very simple. In Northern Ireland in 1998, people were given a 35-page document, and 6 or 8 weeks, I think it was, to read it, about whether they should vote for the Good Friday Agreement. Everybody knew, 35 pages, what they were voting for or against, and we got peace in Northern Ireland. That was a referendum properly conducted. The Scottish referendum in 2014 was predicated in part on the assumption that if you in Scotland leave the United Kingdom, you will not be members of the European Union. And the voters in Scotland, many of them, because I spent time covering that, were persuaded by that argument. Indeed, I think it was a very important argument to make, because Catalonia, for example, one of the reasons Catalonia is still in Spain was precisely for this reason. And then, 2 years later, in 2016, based on 16 words in an advisory referendum, the 16 words where we should we or should we not leave the EU? 16 words, not 35 pages, not a thought-out campaign, by votes of people mostly in England. Northern Ireland was seriously disrupted, and the Scottish voters who voted to stay in the United Kingdom were told, your votes don't matter. Now, if you believe in the United Kingdom, as some of the flag wavers and Brexiteers were claiming, you can't do this. And it still makes me extremely angry, not just because we are a lesser country, not just because any of us who go abroad for our holidays is going to get stuck in queues, although Keir Starmer, I hope, is managing to be on the case here. It gets me very angry that within Britain, and this is why I've written How Britain Ends, is a book about how this kind of blinkered stupidity. I'm not saying we shouldn't leave the European Union, but we should leave the European Union after debate, deciding how we're going to do it, and tell people how we're going to do it, not 16 words in an advisory referendum, which Boris Johnson then turns into a mess.
And sloganising, take back control, betrayal now, and all that, if there's any attempt to move closer.
And so what, the most recent book is Britain is Better Than This, because what I try to focus on, for example, is we've got more Nobel Prize winners at Cambridge University than any country in the world, except the United States and Britain itself. We're not stupid. We have got great deal of personal trust between our people. So why do we keep screwing up in recent years? What has gone wrong with the British system? And so I talk about that. I also talk about, there's a chapter called Dead Cats, Strategic Lying and Truth Decay. And those of us in the journalistic profession will know that a dead cat is to throw something on the table. It was from Linton Crosby, that great that great Australian friend of Boris Johnson, who said, if you're really in trouble, throw a dead cat on the table. Just say something completely outrageous, like quote Winnie the Pooh he quoted at the United Nations. I can't remember. You know, that kind of stuff.
Well, there was Peppa Pig World as well to the CBI, I think.
You know, Donald Trump's a master of it as well. He literally threw dead cats on the table during the presidential election. He said, those Haitian immigrants, they're eating cats and dogs in Ohio. Well, we found very little evidence, indeed no evidence of this. But that was a dead cat on the table. And it's a way of taking the headlines and distracting us all from what is really going on. So all that is what motivates me now to continue to write books about where Britain is going, how we can capitalize on our wonderful culture, our extraordinary culture, our great musicians, our fantastic writers, and even our great universities, some of which are in some trouble now because of finance problems. We can do better, and we are better.
Do you think we'll ever see, in our lifetime, another referendum on the European Union, not necessarily on rejoining, but the current government, Keir Starmer, for goodness sake, as shadow Brexit secretary in opposition, was campaigning for another referendum, and now nothing seems to be happening. Yes, there's the so-called reset, but it's a very, very gentle and kind of below the radar one.
Yeah, I think Keir Starmer thinks he's got other problems, and if he moves incrementally towards it, we will get somewhere. I noticed that the British public, including, I know quite a few voters who voted to leave, who all the ones I know regretted it. One who's a builder told me he was going to vote to leave, and then about 2 years later he said, I'm having real problems. I'm doing very well in the building business. I was going to buy this house in Corfu, and the Greek anyway, he didn't buy it because of the problems. So I think regret has set in. I think referendums in the British system are pretty useless unless they're really well thought out. And this is not an advisory referendum, and these 16 words are far too vague for anyone. And then you get someone like Boris Johnson, who didn't seem to understand moving the Irish border into the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and Scotland possibly is going to cause some problems. How do we get such people?
Well, I'll leave that unanswered. Let's as we come to a close, talk about what you're up to now. Now, I can do some kind of textual analysis on the background shot there, and indeed the way you've dressed up for us, Gavin, and just that close shave you've had and all that. You've kicked back a bit, haven't you? And as I say, let's do the analysis. So tennis is big there. This is like one of those photographs of the royal family, isn't it? Staged in the palace, where then the papers go and look at that photograph that shows they're in, and look at that Tupperware box. Oh, with Her Majesty who's passed. Look, she puts her Rice Krispies in Tupperware boxes. She's frugal and all that. So we've got tennis. Passes there, are they for music festivals, running shoes, and of course the musical instruments. Have I more or less summed it up?
Yeah. I should say that my wife's a musician, so you wouldn't want me to start.
Okay, right. We'll pass on those. How's the tennis?
Tennis is getting better, actually. Yeah, I have to. After years of playing squash and racquetball in the United States, which is very, very different, I finally managed to get a reasonable forehand at tennis. My backhand's always been quite good, but my forehand's been terrible. When I started taking a few lessons, I could hit the ball way out of the court.
Right, yeah. Over the fence. What about paddle? It seems to be all the rage, taking off where I am. I'm thinking
of doing that, but the trouble is, I think paddle is likely to get me back into the old squash thing rather than trying to get the topspin forehand going. Let's put it this way: Alcaraz is not in danger,
right?
But I like playing tennis.
And the books, the writing. So is that the main employment, so called, at the moment? Have you got another one in gestation?
I'm thinking about another one. I've done 5 novels and 5 nonfiction, but I'm also doing a lot of podcasting, actually. I do one called This Is Not a Drill, which is about national security issues, and once a week. And This Is Not a Drill was supposed to be kind of fairly relaxing, and so on. What could possibly go wrong? But we've had, the invasion of Ukraine, we've had the problems in the China Sea, we've had India, Pakistan, and we've had the Trump presidency. So, yeah.
One or two things to deal with. Well, Gavin, thank you very much indeed for coming on this podcast, Legends of News. You are one. Thank you very much indeed. And good to see you, mate. Hold on. Before we end here, I've got to ask, I forgot this one. Didn't you impersonate me once to get an upgrade on a flight? Somebody told me that. Somebody misrecognised you on a flight. Said, aren't you Dermot Murnaghan? And said, oh yeah, come and sit in the nice cabin because the BBC only paid for you to turn right.
I tell you what, no, it's sort of the right story, good enough for journalism. But I'll tell you what did happen. Somebody came up to me on a flight from, I think, the Far East and said, Mr. Alagaya, would you like to go on the flight deck?
Oh dear.
They thought I was George.
Yeah, lovely George.
Missed. Yeah, and that was a few years ago when you could go on the flight deck, and I did.
Lovely memories of George there to end on. Gavin, thank you very much indeed. Good to see you, and more power to your podcasting and your writing.
Thank you.